Hello and welcome to the first Trash to Track video. Recently I have obtained a number of models that are well past their best. Some have got bits missing and none of them are runners, so I thought I'd start a series showing you guys at home the restoration of these locos and see if I can rescue them from the trash and reactivate them to the track. We will also DCC fit them along the way. In this episode we are starting with this very sorry looking Dean Goods, made by Mainline in the early to mid 1980s. This model is in deplorable condition. It is covered in dust and what look like dog hairs. This loco has truly seen better days and does not run at all with the battery test, so I'm going to strip it right back and do a ground up restoration. There are one or two items missing from this locomotive, most notably one of the tender toolboxes, and one of the whistles is missing whilst the other has been crudely glued on with super glue. All the levers and handles in the tender though, amazingly, are all still there and present. Amazingly, the dome, which was very loose, has also not been lost. When stripping the loco, it's advisable to get a small plastic tub just to keep all the parts together so you don't lose any. First off, I'm going to separate the bodies from their chassis and clean them in warm soapy water. This boiler body has got a screw through the cab floor, and it's also got one underneath near the front coupling. The screw in the cab floor is not original, has been added by the previous owner after the screw-in securing lugs underneath had broken off in the past. As I separate the bodies from their chassis, you'll be able to see just how much fluff and crud is encased on this model. It has been stored somewhere unlovingly and has really suffered over the past few years. I've never come across a loco quite as dirty as this one before. Look at the mess in that tender footwell. That is truly disgusting. And the crud on the wheels, no wonder it wasn't picking up any electricity. You'll notice now how I have some trouble removing the tender body. I was unaware at the time of filming this, but the rear buffer beam holds the tender body on with two securing lugs. The reason I overlooked this is because the previous owner has superglued a tail lamp onto the back of the tender, and it looked for all intents and purposes that the tender body had been glued on in the rear, so I attempted to separate it, not realising that there was two lugs that should have been removed first. I will repair these lugs later on in the video. Now that I've finally got the tender body off, I'm going to have to mill away some of the tender weight to accept the DCC chip later on. I'm also going to attempt to try the motor directly with a 9-volt battery. That way we know if the motor's had it or not. Yeah, as you can see, the motor turns with direct power to the brushes, which means that the motor itself is sound, but I will still strip it down and give it a good clean up, as you can see, this model is dirty and it has dirt everywhere. Now I'm going to try and clean up this body shell in some warm soapy water. This is just warm water with washing up liquid. Firstly, using an old makeup brush, I brush off some of the loose debris and fluff. Not much at all comes off, it is well and truly caked on. I've been upstairs to the bathroom and borrowed my wife's toothbrush to scrub this, so I must get this done before bedtime, otherwise she may notice. Giving the shell a good scrub, it's now I notice that the rear of the loco body shell is also broken. I wash all the parts and then set them on paper towel to dry overnight. It's immersing the tender body in warm water has highlighted some glue residue that I'll have to try and remove that is in the front of the tender where the coal falls down. I don't know what this glue is, it looks like it's some sort of PVA, maybe there was a driver fitted previously. I'll just quickly rinse off this toothbrush and get it back upstairs before the wife finds out. Now that the shells have been cleaned, we can see the damage to the cab roof where the whistles have been glued into place. We can also look for any more damage on the body shells now that they're relatively clean. It's actually come up not too bad. The lamp has stuck firm on the front there, but you can see the damage on the back. I'm going to have to look into this later on, although it doesn't seem to be impeding the model too much at the moment. Looking at the tender body shell, this has cleaned up quite nicely, but as you can see there is a toolbox missing at the front of the tender body. Looking through my spares box, I find a part from an old Airfix Royal Scot. It isn't an exact match, but with a suitable modification and a little bit of modelling filler, I'm sure I can make a representation to replace the toolbox that is missing, as spare parts for these models are hard to come by. We will have a look at that later on to see how we get on. Now I'm going to strip the motor down. First we have to remove the front pickup wires and separate the drive wheels from the tender. The tender and drive wheels are permanently coupled with the pickup wires. I'll remove any part that I can for cleaning later on. I have given the front a bit good dusting with the makeup brush, and now I'm stripping down the front drive wheel section. It is a little difficult, but this keeper plate clips in place, and with a gentle flick you can see that everything is released. The drive wheels, the base plate, which is filthy and covered in grease. You'll also notice that the drive wheels are filthy, and the pickups are absolutely caked in grease and fluff. I mean, that is just disgusting. No wonder it wasn't picking up any electricity. Now it's time to remove the tender weight by undoing these two screws. Be careful when you do this, as there are two small plastic washers underneath these screws that you must keep. Do not lose these, otherwise the tender weight will not go back on properly. Once released, and I'll drop the motor at the bottom of the chassis frame, you can also drop the pickup part through it as well. It becomes apparent that the tender chassis is also broken and cracked at one end. At this point in the restoration I was really questioning whether or not this loco was going to be worth doing up at all. Now I can look at the tender motor in more detail, and you can see that even the drivetrain, the grease on this has hardened over time and gone quite jelly-like, and will need all cleaning off. It's really thick. I don't know who's lubricated this or what they've done with it, but it looks like old engine oil. All this motor will be stripped down, and all the plastic parts will end up in the same hot water bath as what I washed the body shell with. Now I remove the rear motor keeper plate to access the motor from behind. The wires I will remove, as well as we will be trying to DCC fit this later on in the video. I do find it unusual with this model that undoing these two screws releases the motor keeper plate at the rear of the motor armature. I've not seen this before on a model, as I've not done a mainline one up before, but usually you take the front plate off and get access to the brushes. I now remove the keeper plate to release the tender drive wheels. I have a second plastic tub now and keep all the tender parts separate from the front so as not to mix the screws up and hopefully aid with reassembly later on. Now I remove all the gears off the gear train on the motor. The smallest gears are held in by these brass pins. The other gears are removed as they are only push fit. These gears are covered in grease and oil and really are manky. The armature has this plastic piece on it to stop short circuits, and when I remove the armature, the brushes are heavily worn, there is carbon everywhere, and that is one of the filthiest armatures I have ever seen whilst doing a model train up. That needs a good clean. All these plastic parts and the motor body housing itself I'm going to clean with warm soapy water to remove all of the carbon build-up, grease, fluff and hairs. Whilst putting all the parts into a plastic tub, I noticed that the motor rear keeper plate has got a crack in it all the way across. If this breaks, this restoration will be game over, so I've got to be careful with this. It's when I emptied all the water out I've realised I found this floating in the top of it. Looking around the model, it's when I realise it's come off the tender body, as the other one is still in the tender chassis plate. I will reattach these to the tender body and restore it to its proper use later on in the video, so that the tender body doesn't have to be glued back on and can be held in place by its buffer beam as was originally designed. Here we have all the plastic and metal parts that I've washed with warm water laying out to dry overnight. There sure are a lot of parts, and you must make sure you do not lose any of the small washers that make up part of the motor mounting. Now that everything is dried, I find that the tender paintwork is in not very good condition at all. It has got large white faded areas and the paint is coming off when I rub it with just a cotton bud and water. It is well past its best. I wasn't planning on doing a repaint on this model, but now it looks like I've got no choice. I'm going to strip it down and remove all the parts I can, and then I'm going to prime and repaint this model. I'm going to be using Railmax GWR Loco Green in acrylic and my airbrush. Washing all the motor parts in the warm soapy water did bring them up quite nicely, but there was a lot of grease still left on them and carbon deposits. So I will give them a further clean with the cotton buds and methylated spirits, which is the method I usually use. Once I've cleaned all the other parts, I focus on cleaning the armature. I clean this by using my fiberglass pencil and then methylated spirits on a cotton bud. It comes up shining like a new pin. Remember, when cleaning the armature, you must clean the gaps in between the copper plates, otherwise this may lead to short circuits in the future. When all the bits had been washed and the water emptied, I found these two tiny white washers and was unsure where they came from. Having looked online and sought help on social media, I was told that they sit either side of the armature on the armature shaft. If you do not put these back on, the armature will not sit properly in the motor housing and will not run properly. This will cause excessive wear to brushes and may even fail the loco completely. Now I start to reassemble the motor by putting the armature in and then the armature keeper plate as we saw before. These white gears are different. One has a very small diameter hole and one has a large one. The small diameter hole goes on the armature shaft and the other goes next to it to the left hand side and slides underneath. It looks odd having the gear floating on the back of the armature like that, but there is a small shaft inside the rear keeper plate of the motor that holds it into position, as we'll see later on. We then add the left hand large gear to the tender frame. Then the keeper plate goes on, aligning the small shaft inside with the large hole in the white gear. Before adding the keeper plate, please remember to add some lubrication. I use Expo Tools oil in a handy dispenser and have never had any problems with this at all in the past. As you can see in this clip, I've put on the right hand large gear on the tender frame and I'm struggling to get the keeper plate on. That right hand gear doesn't go on until the keeper plate is on. That goes on second. That was an error I made, but every day is a school day, as they say. Now I refit all the other gears in the gear train, ready for some lubrication and final reassembly and testing of the motor. These pins hold the small gears in place have a tiny black washer on them. Please ensure when you take it apart you do not lose these, as they will be extremely difficult to replace later on. Screwing the rear keeper plate back on, we will then focus our attention on the brushes before we give the motor a test. Whilst doing this, add a tiny amount of lubrication to both shafts in the rear keeper plate. The brushes that came out of the model are extremely worn and not very much use at all. The difference between these and the replacement Hornby brushes is incredible. This engine really has been worked hard over its life. As you can see, I got a brand new Hornby brush out of my spares box. The new Hornby brush and the existing or old brush are put side by side, and as you can see, the old brushes are almost completely worn down to being absolutely useless. I must apologise now for this shocking camera work. I put the new brushes in place in the motor. The springs that came with the model are still luckily in good order. At the top of the picture you'll see both brass brush holders that I will reuse, as there's nothing wrong with these. You basically put the spring in and then apologise for the dodgy camera angles again, but holding the spring in place in the holder, you put the spring over the top of the brush and it is basically a friction fit into the motor housing, and that's it. The motor is reassembled with new brushes and has been completely cleaned from the top to the bottom. Now we give the motor a quick test with the battery and voila! A fully serviced and rebuilt motor that is running like a Swiss watch. The crack in the motor frame appeared to be just on the outside and not on the inside, so hopefully it will last a good few years in service. Now I'm going to release all the old tyres and clean the plastic tender wheels up. All I use for this is meths and a cotton bud. Once cleaned, it's time to reassemble the tender frame and the wheels. Now the tyres have been replaced with new spares, there is a spring that goes in the front of the tender body that holds the front axle down. We can reassemble the tender wheels and give them a light lubrication before screwing the tender keeper plate back on. Once all the tender has been reassembled, give it a final test to make sure it's all still working as it should. Then I remove the slight over-oiling that you can see on some of the gears when I test the motor. This motor rebuild was quite comprehensive and took a couple of hours to complete, but without it there was just no hope in getting this model back onto the track. Now it's all back together. As I said, we give it another test with the 9-volt battery when I can find somewhere to hold the model, and there you go. You can see all the wheels are working, all the gears are meshing as they should, and the lubrication has not gone onto the armature at all, because otherwise it wouldn't work properly. I'm really happy with how this rebuilt tender is working. The motor is strong and powerful, and hopefully we can get the model running and looking as good as this motor's running. Now the motor and tender has been rebuilt, we can focus on priming up these body shells ready for painting. Before I do prime them up, I'm going to remove the handrails off the boiler and smoke box. I also remove the smoke box door as it's a loose part and came off when I took the handrails off. I've also got to modify that Royal Scott toolbox so that we can replace the one that's missing, ready for painting. Right, now they're all primed up and the replacement toolbox has been made, we will take a look at some of the detail on this model casting. There is a lot of rivet detail on this model for considering its age, and then you've got the boiler washout plugs as well on the firebox. The model has primed up really well, and hopefully any blemishes or body deformities will be hidden when the new paint arrives. The smoke box door has got nice rivet detail and a smoke box handle, and the hinge detail present. Once this has been airbrushed into its correct colour and the roof black applied, I will be detail painting the inside of this cab, as even considering its age, the cab interior is detailed to quite a high standard, considering how old this is. I will pick out the pipework in brass coloration, paint the gauges and the regulator the correct colour. I'll also paint the floor brown, as I believe these locos had a wooden floor. The replacement toolbox looks good now. I've modified it and applied it to the tender, as do the handles and the fire iron brackets. The high coal load on this moulding is to hide the motor in the tender. The tender also has a little bit of rivet detail, and then on the rear there is a water filler cap and imitation lifting rings. Now I've examined all the body parts, now they've been primed, I'll head over and get the airbrush out and give them a coat of GWR green. Once the green was dry, I masked it off and then sprayed matte black out of a Humbrol aerosol can. I removed the sandboxes on the loco and then the tender toolboxes after painting green, as they were easier to remove and then reapply later than to apply masking to apply the black. I will detail paint the interior of the cab, but now I'll remove the masking and see how the paint job has turned out. I do enjoy this part of modelling, as it's the grand reveal and it can tell you whether or not you've done a good job of actually repainting the model. Now the masking's been removed, I am really pleased with how this repaint has come out. The masking on the splashes and the boiler has not allowed any paint bleed at all that I can see. It really has come out smashing. The GWI green looks better than the factory applied green that the model had before, that was covered in blemishes, black marks and white spots after I'd washed it. Now it's time to detail paint the handrails and cab interior. I did originally paint the handrails on the tender body silver, but once it had dried I removed this and repainted them green, as it looked just a little bit too blingy for a 1930s goods engine. These fine details that Mainline and Hornby have kept on this Dean Goods really do set it apart. It really does look nice and is a run for the money for some of the contemporary tender models that are out there. The only letdown being the high coal load. I now paint the interior of the cab black, and once that's dry I will paint the floor and pipework. I pick out a couple of silver bits on the body shell, handrails and reversing lever. Right, whilst all that paint dries, I'm going to disassemble the front driving wheels. These need a very good clean, as they pick up all the electricity for the motor. First I unscrew the wheel nuts with a small hex nut screwdriver. Be careful not to lose any of the small hex nuts that hold the side rods to the driving wheels. These wheels are absolutely filthy, as is the rest of the model. There is fluff and gunk all around these tiny little nuts that hold the side rods on. I'm going to have to remove all of them to remove all of the dirt. Once all the side rods are removed, I use my usual technique of methylated spirits and a cotton bud to clean around all the threads and the pivot pins for the side rods. There is so much dirt on these models, it is even filling the spokes in the wheels. Here I'm pushing all the dirt through the wheel spokes using my fine tweezers. You will see just how much crud comes out of these. I don't know what the previous owner used this model for, but it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't use it for ploughing a field. I then thoroughly clean all the wheel backs so that when the pickups are reassembled later there is nothing to stop connectivity between the wheels and the pickups. I clean all the side rods with the methylated spirit approach, and then I polish all the wheel treads with my fiberglass brush and methylated spirits to remove any fibres. The wheels were dirty and did really shine up like new once this was done. The base plate with the brass pickups fitted is then tackled next. This is horrendously dirty, and as you can see, with just a simple wipe with a cotton bud, a lot of dirt comes off. All these pickups will be thoroughly cleaned, but please be gentle, as if you bend the brass pickups it will be hard to replace them as they were before. The wheel base plate is also cleaned with meths and a cotton bud, as this has got a lot of dried on grease on it as well. Now to reassemble the front drive wheels. I put the tender drawbar in first, and then the base plate clips in, holding this in place. Then it's a case of sliding the wheels in place one at a time. A word of warning, the middle wheel will only go back in one way for correct alignment for the quartering. The middle wheel also has a thicker, smaller weight on it to differentiate it between the other two. Now all the wheels are back in the base plate, gently push the pickups behind the wheel treads. They are quite springy, so should go in quite easily. Just be gentle that you don't break any off or bend them out of shape. Then once they're in, it's a case of clipping the end on and then giving it a test roll to make sure that all is free moving. That's good. It won't roll freely because of the pressure that the pickups put on the back of the wheels. Then I reassemble all the side rods and put back in the clean nuts and tighten them all up with my hex screwdriver. Once all the rods are back in place, the brake linkage detail was put back on and it was placed on ours for another rolling test. That is running beautifully. As I said, it will not be free rolling as the pressure that the pickups put on the wheels. Now it's time to tackle the transfers. I ordered these from Fox Transfers, and what I do is I first wet the body side after applying a gloss coat. I wet the body side with a cotton bud and then submerge the transfer in water. After several minutes, it will loosen on the backing sheet and can be slid off onto the model. Using tweezers and a cotton bud, be gentle that you don't fold the transfer. Once the transfer's on the model, I blot away any excess water and then manoeuvre the transfers into the desired position gently using a cocktail stick. Be gentle at this point, as you wouldn't want to ruin the paintwork or the transfers. Now you're getting so close to finishing this tender body. Luckily, there aren't many transfers to go on this model. There are only two, one on each side of the tender. Once I'm happy that it's all level, I check the transfers with a straight edge. I use a steel ruler, but anything that's got a straight edge will work with this. The process is repeated for the other side of the body shell. Then once you're happy with the transfers, both body shells were given a coat of satin varnish to seal it all in and give it a nice sheen, as preserved locos should have. This loco will run on a preserved line on my layout. Now it's time to reassemble the main body shell with all the details I took off it. First I put the safety valve in with a satisfying click, and then I go to work with all the other little details, the handrails and front buffer beam. First of all, the smoke box door needs putting back on. I took this off for ease of painting and to remove the internal ballast weight. That also just push fits nicely and is held in place when the handrails go back on. Then I reattach the cab. It's at this point where I think it is actually quite fortuitous that the rear of the chassis is slightly damaged, as it makes refitting the cab a lot easier. As you can just about see there, I also picked the cab front spectacle plates out with some brass paint. This was applied using a cocktail stick. Now to repair the tender chassis, I'm going to use the super glue and baking powder method that I've seen other people use on YouTube. When you apply the super glue, add on some of the baking powder and it forms a chemical bond that dries instantly. It also dries super strong. So after applying the super glue, I add some of the baking powder. As you'll then see, it forms an extremely strong bond and it's almost as strong as the originally moulded plastic. That won't break again for a very long time. Any excess baking powder is then tapped off the model and the model cleaned with a damp cotton bud. Next up, I reapply the front sandboxes and tender toolboxes that I took off when I painted the black earlier on. These just clip into place in the holes that were there. The tender toolbox that I made has to be put in place with super glue. As it's not original, there are no fixing lugs for it. Earlier on, I mentioned the tender fixing lugs that are held on by the buffer beam. I now refit these using the same superglue and baking powder method as earlier, and this forms an extremely strong bond as before, so that the tender body can be screwed and held back in place as it should be by the front fixing screw and the buffer beam. As you can see there, they are both back in place and look just as they should. I'm very happy with how this restoration is progressing and look forward to seeing the finished result. Now it's time to refit the tender motor to the chassis plate. I've cut down the tender weight I've literally cut it in half, so I've got room for a decoder. This is reapplied using the small washer and screw that we saw me remove earlier on. Now we fit the decoder to the motor. The orange and grey leads go directly to the motor terminals and I solder those on. And I use a very small Zen decoder so that it fits in the gap in the tender body left by the removal of part of the weight. Once I've soldered the orange and grey wires on, I will give it a test with the 9-volt battery to make sure that it works. A word of warning here, not all decoders will work like this. It depends if the decoders are set up for DC operation as well as DCC. And there you see the decoder and the wiring all works, so that's another step in the right direction. Now the whole ensemble is put back together. The pickup wires from the front part are stripped and tinned with the solder, and then they are put back through the tender frame and soldered to the red and black wires on the decoder and then insulated with some heat shrink. The decoder is then shoehorned into the tender body and the tender body is refit to its chassis with the screws and the buffer beam securing lugs on the rear. Before I reapply the body shell to the drive wheel chassis, I open up the whistle holes with a 1mm drill bit to take in the new whistles. I found these in my spares box, and although they may not be Great Western Railway pattern or correct for a Dean Goods, I thought I'd use them as they had them to hand, and they look pretty good once they're fitted to the model. These are fitted into the holes using a small amount of super glue, and then they're held in until the glue sets. These really do set the model off, and they do look the part even if they're not correct pattern. Next up, I'm going to reassemble the front body shell to the drive wheel chassis, and then put the securing screw back through the cab floor and use the small nut underneath as the previous owner had done. One of the last jobs is to refit the front buffer beam. That just simply clips in place, and then reapply the couplings. Now it's all back together, I'm going to give it one final test with the battery on a piece of test track to see if it all works. That's good. Excellent. As the cab is so open and detailed on this model, I have in my hand here Nigel and Paul, a driver and fireman for this Dean Goods. These two likely lads couldn't get very far in life, so decided to join the Great Western Railway as a driver and fireman. Nigel does all the hard work while Paul stands in the corner pointing at the cab backhead, saying what a good job he's doing, yet not actually achieving a great deal. The final finishing touch is to add these etched brass number plates from Fox, depicting number 2516, which coincidentally is the only preserved Dean Goods left in existence. I was unaware of this at the time, as 2516 was the number that the model came with. I attached these using a small amount of satin acrylic varnish on the back of the number plate. This doesn't leave any marks on the body side, unlike superglue can. I position them on the body side with tweezers, ensuring they're in the correct position and level, and then any excess varnish is quickly wiped away with a dry cotton bud. And that concludes the rebuild of this Mainline Dean Goods. Let's remind ourselves of what we had to start with. Here we see the Dean Goods is totally encrusted with dirt, is covered in fluff and dog hairs and God knows what, and is missing some parts and was a complete non-runner. The dome was loose, and this model really had seen better days. The paint is faded and lacklustre, and it needed a general maintenance. This loco really was only fit for the trash bin. And this is what it looks like now. It's had a brand new coat of shiny paintwork. It has been rebuilt from the ground up. Every nut, screw and everything has been cleaned. Driver and fireman added, and it's also fit for DCC running. We have saved this from the trash and reactivated it to the track. And here we see the Dean Goods hauling its first freight train in however many years. It's nice to see this model has been restored back to operational condition. So thank you so much for watching. I'll leave you now with some shots of it running around the layout, and stay tuned for the next episode of Trash to Track, where we take a totally damaged or non-running loco and restore it hopefully to a condition like you see here, where it can be fit again for use on a DCC modern railway. Thanks again, please like, share and subscribe, and I welcome any comments or feedback in the comments below. Please check out our new Facebook group, Dan's Model Railways, for updates and previews of upcoming videos. Goodbye.